Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and also to click on the notification, that bell icon. That way when we are doing our thing, YouTube lets you know. Today we're continuing my top 100 games of all time, and I will be covering games 80 through 71. So without any further ado, let's get straight to my number 80 board game of all time, Jamaica, designed by a trio of designers, Malcolm Braff, Bruno Cathala, and Sebastian Pauchon. And this is published by GameWorks. And what's interesting about this game is that it was ranked as high as number 35 for me last year, so it's definitely dipped down. And lots of that has to do with the fact that many of the people who I play this game with have grown cold on it. So almost I've been influenced by others, outside sources that have kind of made me lose a little bit of my enjoyment for this game. But even so, I must say that this game is a very fun family weight game where players are racing, they're pirates, and they're racing around the island of Jamaica, trying to be the first player to make it all the way to Port Royal, because those who make it to Port Royal will have a guarantee of 15 victory points, which will pretty much secure them the game. Now, there is a chance of you winning this game overall, because it's about having the most victory points, even if you're not the person who wins the race. If you have a combination of other factors that contribute to lots of victory points, the fact that you do decent in the race, the fact that you've collected and acquired lots of coin along the way, which will contribute towards your victory points, the fact that you went to these secret treasure caves and brought back booty that was actually contributing positive points for you, because sometimes you can end up bumping into curses, and those curses will actually subtract points from your final game. So yeah, all these things you're factoring it in. There's a really cool mechanism, a evening or morning action mechanism where you roll the dice and you assign the dice to the corresponding spots, morning or evening action, and the active player does that. And then that determines the program action selection that each player is going to do, simultaneously select and then execute in clockwise turn order. And based on the combination of the pips on the die on the evening and morning actions, combined with what your cards have and the actions that they do for you, that will help you determine your decision. There is some mean combat going on in this game. This is a pirate themed game after all, where players are attacking one another. Still my number 80 board game of all time, Jamaica. Now we move on to my number 79, and my number 79 is Deception, Murder in Hong Kong. And this game has dropped down a bit too, not as much as Jamaica, but this game was my number 50 of all time last year. Now this game is a game of Clue for gamers almost, right? A modern way of putting you into that same idea, where players play a group of detectives, investigators that are trying to crack the puzzle. They're trying to figure out who is the murderer, and in particular, what weapons and items were associated to that act, right? Because if you don't have some evidence, then even if the body language of the murderer betrays him or her, you cannot confirm it, you cannot prove it, and hold them accountable in a court of law, so to speak, right? So you're trying to figure all those things out. And this game plays really, really quick, much quicker than a game of Clue, for example. And it has everybody totally involved and immersed. And there's 3 different roles. You could either be an investigator who's trying to solve the puzzle. You can be the forensic scientist who knows the murder and the weapons and is just trying to silently, without any verbal cues, indicate the clues based on these tiles that come out. And then finally, you got the murderer who's just trying to, go under the radar, or at the very least, be crafty in his choice or her choice of weapons and items, so that even if people catch on to them, they'll never be able to combine the 2 pieces of evidence correctly in order to actually sentence him or her to jail, kind of thing. So it's really fun, very interactive, very immersive in a short, quick experience. And again, very versatile in the sense that it's one of those social deduction games where any role you take is a very satisfying experience. My number 79 board game of all time, Deception, Murder in Hong Kong. And now we move on to my number 78 board game of all time, and that is Sheriff of Nottingham. And this, again, the trend for these last couple games is that these games have been knocked down. This game has been knocked down tremendously because I actually had it ranked as high as number 27 last year. And very similar to Jamaica, one of the reasons why this game has gone down is because of the fact that it's grown cold among my gaming circle, right? Because I very much enjoy this game. This game is a bluffing game. First of all, the base of the game, the skeleton of the game, is just this simple set collection that scores you points at the end of the game, not only for the intrinsic value of these sets that you're getting, but also by having the majority or secondary amounts of these different sets of different types of goods at the end of the game. So you're trying to math that all out and plan it out and execute it accordingly. But on top of it all, you don't just simply collect these sets. Quite often what you're doing is you're sneaking these goods past the evil Sheriff of Nottingham. And every player on the table takes a turn being the Sheriff of Nottingham. As a matter of fact, they usually take 2 turns being the Sheriff of Nottingham and trying to see who's bluffing you, right? Because first of all, there's some illegal contraband goods that get you additional points. They actually are more valuable than your legal goods that players might be trying to sneak past you. So you got to kind of figure it all out, right? Based on their body language, what they're saying, probabilities, based on what they, report or declare having in their little bags, based on what they've done in previous actions, or even your rapport with that player, like that individual, how you've seen him or her act in the past. All these things you're using and factoring in your determination of who may or may not be lying to you. But the really cool thing about this game is that even the legal goods, sometimes you got to sneak it past the wicked sheriff here, because legally, even if the good in and of itself is legal, you can only declare 1 good per turn. So if you want to sneak in a couple extra goods of a different type, even that will require you lying and out bluffing the sheriff. There's all sorts of bribing taking place. Players can bribe to prevent the sheriff from, checking their bag, or they can bribe to make the sheriff check someone else's bag. Really cool, fun game. My number 78 board game of all time, Sheriff of Nottingham. My number 77 board game of all time is Cuzco, designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Michael Kiesling, and this is actually a new game to the list for me this year. Just played for the first time this past calendar year, and this game is a sequel to Tikal, the classic Spiel des Jahres winner from 1999 by the same duo of designers. And it's actually a reprint and a rebranding of the original sequel, which was otherwise known as Java. And Super Meeple just recently, about a year and a half ago or so, released this edition named Cuzco. And this is so cool because I'm a big fan of Tikal. It may or may not show up later on this list. And this game has lots of the same elements of Tikal as far as area majority, action point allowance, right? You have a certain amount of action points and you have a bunch of different options, a pool of different actions you could choose. And each of the different actions is worth a different amount of action points. And you're budgeting the amount of action points you have. In this game in particular, you have 6 action points. And you're deciding between all these different actions in order to execute your strategy as effectively as possible. But what's really cool about the area majority about in this game is that this is a 3-dimensional game where not only are you building and expanding the board through tile placement, from left to right and up and down, but you're also vertically building and expanding because you're placing tiles on top of each other to create like mountainous regions, right? And what's interesting about this is that the area majority is determined based on not only whoever has the most meeples, but in particular, or the most workers, the Incas as the game refers to it, but in particular, whoever has the most Incas at the highest level within a given region, right? In particular, a city. That's where you're trying to have the majorities, the cities where there are temples. And that is so cool and so neat because, yes, you can work hard to, invest and put lots of your Incas on the board and onto the map in order to get them, populating these areas. But at the end of the day, if you don't manipulate the tile placement, which is a very intricate mechanism in this game, the way you place tiles is not so straightforward. So there is lots of thought and strategy based and put into making those decisions. But if you don't maneuver yourself shrewdly in order to end up being on top of your opponent being higher than they are, then you're not going to have the majority in this game. And when you do have the majority, it grants you lots of privileges, the ability to increase and expand your temples, which earn you victory points, the ability to score for the majorities at the end of certain scoring rounds or at the end of the game. Things like that are very much benefiting you if you are the player who has the majority in those highest regions. Really cool, really neat, a stunner and a beautiful game to just look at once you're all done. Once you've played the game, you look at it and you're like, wow, you know, that's a sight to behold. My number 77 board game of all time, Cuzco. And now we move on to my number 76, and that is Port Royal, designed by Alexander Pfister. And this edition here is published by Steve Jackson Games. And this is just a small card game, folks. This is basically the components along with the rule book. And this is a press your luck game with a pirate theme, but it's really cool because unlike some other very popular press your luck games, for example, Ink and Gold, you feel like you're doing some very thoughtful strategic decisions throughout the game. It's not just the decision of, do I want to push forward or not? There is some of that going on here because, you know, players are trying to draw cards and get different ships, merchant ships from the different countries or nations. There's 5 different nations represented in this game. And they bring you money, which you use in turn to buy different characters that give you special powers, but also give you victory points in order to accomplish the winning of the game. But while you are trying to press your luck by drawing more cards, because if you ever draw two ships of the same nation, you bust. First of all, there's ways of mitigating that luck because some of the characters give you the ability to repel ships. That way you diminish or lower the chances of you busting. But also just the way you manage your money, right? Because you can be conservative and save some of your money for a future turn and buy a character that's very helpful for you. There's so many different ways that you could go about this, right? That makes it much more interesting, again, than some of these other press your luck games. But at the same time, it still has the charm and the appeal that a press your luck game would provide. My number 76 board game of all time, and this one is new to me this year as well, Port Royal. Now we move on to my number 75, and this is another new game. So we have a series of new games that made it to the list this year. And my number 75 is Elder Sign, designed by Richard Launius and Kevin Wilson, published by Fantasy Flight Games in their Arkham Horror File line of games. And I've been enjoying this line of games, but in particular this one here, it's a dice game, not quite a Yahtzee dice game, but instead it's like a roll and lock game where you're rolling dice. You have a pool of dice that you're rolling, and there are ways of getting additional dice added to your pool. And as you're rolling these dice, right, you have your basic green dice, and you can get your yellow and red dice, which are a little bit better throughout the game. You're rolling these dice, you're basically forced to utilize at least one of those with every roll, because you either A, have to use one or more of those to contribute towards a task that you're trying to accomplish in one of the treasure cards, or B, you are getting rid of it. You're discarding one of those cards, one of those dice, because you didn't roll what you needed to do, right? Because the adventure cards here, let me just show you one of them. The adventure cards here have different tasks represented by the symbols on the die that you're trying to accomplish, but you have to accomplish them with one roll, right? You cannot, if the task requires 2 specific dice, you cannot just roll one and then re-roll and hopefully get the other one. Every task has to be completed within one roll. So that makes for a very challenging experience. And throughout the game, you are acquiring items and allies and different things that allow you to mitigate your luck, that add additional dice to your pool, and to figure all that stuff out. It's very abstracted compared to some of the other Arkham Horror style games, or the games within the Cthulhu mythos. But at the same time, it just feels pleasing to me to go about this experience, reading the flavor text on the adventure cards, reading the flavor text on the mythos cards, you know, interacting with my character and what they do for me, interacting with the elder one or the ancient one and what abilities they bring to the table. Factoring all these things in does make for quite a fun experience. albeit maybe not as immersive as some of these other games in the Arkham Horror line of games. But I do find this to be a very satisfying game solo. Even though the game says that it can take up to 8 players, I would never even consider going close to that. I might consider playing this with 2 to 3, but for now, my favorite way of playing this game is solo. My number 75 board game of all time, Elder Sign. And now we move on to my number 74 board game of all time. This is not a new one. This game was ranked for me last year at number 72, so it's actually stayed around the same level, which is very impressive considering the fact that I did play 83 new games this year. My number 74 board game of all time is One Deck Dungeon. I have so much fun playing this game, guys. I mean, first of all, I like the experience of a good dungeon crawler, and also what I like that this game contributes to it is the fact that it's small in table space, it's short in time, and it plays amazingly well solo. This, kind of like Elder Sign, is one of those games that I prefer playing by myself. I mean, really the box only accommodates 1 to 2 players. If you want to play 3 to 4, you'd actually have to buy a second copy of the game. But I'm not really interested in playing it with 3 or 4, or even 2 for that matter. I like playing this game with 1. Basically, you have a deck of cards that you're running through, and the deck of cards represent your dungeon rooms. And there's always 4 dungeon rooms, or at most 4 dungeon rooms available for the hero characters. And you flip those cards, you explore what's there, and there's 2 types of encounters in this game. There's either a peril, which is some sort of challenge, or there is an enemy that you have to combat. And all of these cards, when you defeat them, become multi-purpose cards that level up your character to some extent. They either give them the experience points that you need in order to level up to the next level, or they could be used as items that increase their stats, or they could be used as special once-around abilities or special magic or potion abilities that they can execute in future turns. So all of these things are really cool, and making those decisions is really neat. But throughout the game, you're rolling dice and you're placing them on these encounters in order to solve the puzzle or the challenge that they present. And all of the dice are color-coded, corresponding with the different stats of the different characters. It's really neat. There's a bunch of different characters, a bunch of different bosses, lots of variety for a small game, a game that I've had lots of fun when I'm in the mood to play a solo game, and in particular play a dungeon crawler type of game. Quite often this is the game I bring out. My number 74 board game of all time, One Deck Dungeon. My number 73 board game of all time is Paperback, designed by Tim Fowers. This is a deck building game combined with Scrabble. And I've been hearing about this game for years. This is new to me in recent months, and it's new to the list, therefore. And I've been hearing it for years, and I've always been attracted to the idea. First of all, I love deck builders, and in theory, I've always wanted to like Scrabble. I've never actually liked it for its execution and the fact that players can win based on knowing some small random words and how to use rare letters like a Z and a Q. This game, though, combines what I love, the deck building mechanism, with the neat idea of constructing words, right? I like the idea in concept. So there's so many cool things that these cards can do for you, because first of all, they provide you money to buy more cards, including victory point cards. But you can only get the money that a card provides if you actually use it in the word you create. Also, some of these cards have special powers, special abilities. And again, you can only execute those special abilities if those cards were in the word that you created on that turn. Really cool. You could play this game cooperatively. You could play this game solo. They have an unabridged expansion. They had a spin-off with hardback. Fun game. My number 73 board game of all time, Paperback. Now we move on to my number 72. And my number 72, this game was ranked last year for me at number 43, so it's dropped down a bit, but not too bad, still holding up. My number 72 board game of all time is Kingdom Builder, designed by Donald X. Vaccarino and published by Queen Games. This is a former Spiel des Jahres winner by the famous designer of Dominion, Donald X. Vaccarino. And this game is really neat because what's happening is Players are placing their network of different settlements on the different terrain features of the board. And this game has a modular board. There are 4 sectors for the board, and the base game comes with like 8 different modular boards that you can mix and match accordingly. And basically it has different configurations of the different terrain types. There's like 7 different terrain types, and also some different special locations, because the special locations are places that where you, when you connect your settlements to, they give you tokens that you can use once per round in order to activate a special ability, right? What's really cool about this game is that the scoring conditions change from game to game. One of the ways of scoring always remains the same. If you have settlements connecting next to castles, that's going to give you 3 victory points for every castle that your settlements are connected to. However, every other scoring condition is going to vary from game to game, because the game comes with a bunch of these kingdom cards, as they refer to them, and you're going to randomly or maybe even arbitrarily choose 3 per game. And again, the combination of how these different scoring conditions or kingdom cards complement one another or contrast one another are going to make every single game feel different than the prior one. So that, combined with the fact that you have this modular board, adds for high setup variability. And I love games that have high setup variability. I love variety, and in particular, I love when the variety is there and obvious from the get-go. Yes, lots of games are very replayable because once you learn them or have mastered them, you could try different things. But at the same time, their setup at the beginning of the game is very similar or identical from game to game. That is not the case with Kingdom Builder. And again, figuring out how to optimize your strategy in order to accomplish the goals of the Kingdom cards is such a satisfying experience. Pretty quick game as well, pretty simple, definitely gateway level in the fact that players can easily learn the rules, but I would say it's one of those lifetime to master games that has lots of hidden depth that players can continue to explore for years to come. My number 72 board game of all time, Kingdom Builder. And now we move on to my number 71, which is the last game for this list today. And this game here is another new game. So there's a big chunk of new games on this list right here, on this section of the top 100. My number 71 board game of all time is 1960, The Making of a President, designed by Jason Matthews and Christian Leonard. And this edition here is published by GMT Games. Now, this game here is basically a 2-player only game where players are taking on either Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy in their race to win the 1960 presidential election. And it's such a cool game because, first of all, it can be considered an educational game because you learn a lot about the events that transpired around this game. Because the cards that you're using in order to compete and combat, so to speak, with your opponent are filled with lots of historical references, historical figures, you know, even a little bit of explanations as to things that happened, and gameplay mechanisms or gameplay features that are tied in thematically to these original historical figures and events. Really cool, really neat. Also, this game can be very helpful in allowing a person to grasp the concept of the Electoral College. Even though the Electoral College is not distributed in the same exact way 60 years later, but it's still interesting to understand that concept of, yes, well, not all states are created equal with regard to the Electoral College and the strategy that it takes to focus on some key states, the idea of things like swing states, right? Really cool, really neat. But on top of the fact that this can be looked as an educational game, this is a fun game. The cards that you're playing can be used in one of 2 ways. You could either use them for campaign points, which are basically a currency that you use to travel the country and to increase your influence or your support in the different states. Also, you can use them for their actual event. That is usually something that's either very helpful for you or very detrimental and harmful to the other candidate. And figuring all these things out are really cool. The game plays in 9 rounds, and one of the rounds is actually a debate round, and the other round is the election day round. And those 2 rounds actually play very differently than the other 7 rounds in the game, which I found to be neat and innovative. Just so much fun playing this game. You can campaign for support in media. You can campaign in the different issues that the presidents or the presidential candidates are debating about. So many cool things. It really comes down to a few really tight decisions that players have to make, and very satisfying. I will say this, every time I played, I walked out the president of the United States of America. My number 71 board game of all time, 1960, The Making of a President. Thank you for joining us, folks. How about you click on one of these videos on the screen? If YouTube is showing them to you, it's because they think there's a really good chance that you will like them. Also, check in the description down below so you can see the link to my Patreon and see how you can become a direct supporter of this channel and be more involved in the behind-the-scene process. Check out and research the different tiers available and find one that works for you. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.